Besides that, all I have to do, I guess, is just actually paint the body panels. But as long as paint goes down okay, there's gonna be lots of sanding. I guess as long as that stuff goes well, it might actually not take another month. It might only take a few weeks, 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 a few weeks.
A little more than a few weeks ago, I ended the last episode, part 9 of this Fiero restoration endeavor, with the car finally fully mechanically refurbished. The chassis is now rust-free and looking great, but more importantly, every single moving component on every subsystem for this car has been addressed. Well, except for the shifter mechanism, I actually don't think I've touched that at all. But we're not going to worry about that, the car is practically brand new. And since this practically brand new car can exist in the world without any of its body panels attached to it, I can technically paint the car without having to paint the car. So, after playing musical chairs with some of the future project vehicles for this channel, I loaded up the Fiero into the garage. It's gonna live here until I get all of the panels painted up. And by leaving it here, I now have so much more room in the barn to work in. It's still pretty messy with lots of things taking up space, but hey, I can't complain. This is more than adequate enough space to lay down some paint. And lay down some paint I did. But before putting down any color or clear coat for the main body panels, I wanted to learn on some of the accent panels like the front lip, side skirts, rear trim pieces, and the sail panels. And all of this was shown in the Learning to Paint video from the Saturday Project series. If you haven't already seen that, then I gotta tell you, HVLP painting is definitely a learning process. I still wasn't doing it quite correctly by the end of the video, but a hell of a lot better than when I started. Regardless, the pieces came out looking fantastic. Since then, I've gone ahead and painted some of the remaining metal pieces for the car. All of the components for the luggage rack got a full respray, but I do still need to take care of the rear vents, drip rails for the windows, and mirrors. The process for painting the luggage rack and also what I'll do for the other pieces is the exact same as it was for what was shown in the Saturday Projects video, but instead of using the adhesion promoter I used for the plastic pieces, self-etching primer was used for the metal ones. And these turned out really nicely too. But that's enough lollygagging painting trim pieces that nobody cares about. Shiny, glossy red paint on the body is what you want to see. Well, except for the people that think that this is their car and leave comments telling me what color to paint it. I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to you. Well, you, before you have any dessert, you gotta eat your vegetables first. For those that have experience painting, you know that the painting process is about 5% actual painting and 95% prep work. So many hours go into sanding, filling, priming, and did I mention sanding? It's a lot. Now this is actually what I have most of my experience in. Not just from all of the prototypes I made during my time studying industrial design, but because I've been making props and costume pieces since I was 12 years old. The original draw to my channel was the popularity of my Mark 42 Iron Man helmet build series, where 4 out of the 5 videos were all about the bodywork. Seriously, it's a process to say the least. And it's the same story for Cars 2, but not Cars 3. Luckily for you guys, this is not Trevor Jameson Supra, so I'll be condensing all of the priming and sanding for this car into this one video. So without further ado, let's get started. I wanted to go ahead and tackle the large panels first, just to get them out of the way, those being the hood and the deck lid. And for this, I used a pneumatic orbital disc sander with 180 grit sandpaper. The goal of this stage is just to remove the horribly done paint job and get down to a decent surface. On most cars, you could probably get away with using a more aggressive grit of sandpaper, but since these parts are SMC, they're fiberglass, it's pretty easy to actually burn straight through the paint and cut into the body material and change the contour of the panel, especially corners and edges. This is way softer than aluminum or steel, so for this material, and for the urethane panels too, I just wanted to be cautious. This took quite a while, but eventually the whole thing was sanded smooth. And after that, I moved on to the deck lid. Lots of sanding for this part too, but interestingly enough, it went a lot faster. Not just because it's smaller, but because I don't think that the rear deck lid was ever repainted. That's weird because literally every other panel of this car was. Maybe the original deck lid was, but not this replacement. That's right, I don't think that this is the one that came with the car. There were a few things that led me to believe this. One, there was no bad paint job to sand through, like I said, and two, on the bottom there is this writing done in a paint pen, which is super common with junkyard parts. Something had to have happened in the rear to warrant the deck lid's replacement. And I think that something also has to do with the broken taillight along with the bent bumper bracket we discovered last episode. But an even bigger indicator is the rear glass, because that isn't original either. When gutting out the interior back in part 5, there was so much broken glass hiding on the floor behind the seats, as well as in the cavities of the rear subframe, which you would have seen in that restoration video. Besides the glass shards, there's also the shoddy adhesive job that can be found on the current rear window. And I know that 1980s GM build quality wasn't stellar, but it wasn't this bad. So what happened back here? Was this the same accident that caused all the issues in the front? Or was this after everything was already repaired from that? I don't know. I do know that this is a bit of a tangent from bodywork, yeah, but this just goes to show you that every car has a story. It's not all clear now, but through discoveries like this, we can find out more and more. But okay, so with both of these parts sanded down, they were ready to have some primer laid down on top of them. But to be perfectly honest, I was still a little bit nervous about painting with the HVLP gun at this point. Not that the finish matters too much for this stage, since it'll all be laid on thick and sanded back regardless of how well it goes down, but I still wanted to start on something a little bit smaller. If you don't include the gas cap, the smallest pieces for the Fiero are the fenders and the rear lower quarter panels. And in case you didn't yet realize it, the Fiero only has one side air intake. I'm pretty sure the lack of symmetry would probably bother a lot of people, so I just thought I'd mention it. But these two need to be sanded down. And just like before, they all got hit with the 180 grit on the sander. After that, I also went back over everything with 320, just to smooth out all the deeper scratches left by the 180. Oh, and hey, just in case it wasn't yet clear, I'm not trying to teach how to do bodywork, and I'm definitely not going to teach how to do painting. I did say that bodywork is what I have a lot of experience in, which is true, but that's really only been on smaller things. Prototypes, helmets, all things whose total surface area is less than a single panel on this car. Yes, all the same methods and ideologies apply to this too, but cars are still a different animal. If it looks like I'm doing anything wrong, it's probably because I'm doing it wrong. So I implore you to watch this video to learn what I did to my car, but not necessarily to learn what to do to yours. I'm still very much figuring things out as I go. But what I do know for sure is that these guys need some primer on them. Just like all the things I showed in the Learning to Paint video, the company Eastwood was kind enough to let me try out their paint products. With the exception of maybe a few rattle cans of filler primer I'll be using here and there, everything shown in this video is from them. So thank you so much, Matt, and thank you Eastwood for getting me set up with all this. The HVLP spray gun is their Concourse LT100 model, and the primer that I'm going to be using is their Epoxy Primer. The key word being epoxy, and that means that this is a two-component system. So rather than a typical style paint that simply dries, this undergoes a chemical reaction and solidifies.
It's super durable and a great foundation, especially for the Fiero's panels. Fiberglass and urethane are relatively porous materials, at least compared to sheet metal, so they would otherwise just soak up a lot of the regular primer. That's an issue because, as I showed in part 8, these parts are prone to spider webbing. That's just par for the course with urethane components, but with epoxy primer, it'll act as a barrier between the body and the outer paint, which is supposed to help avoid those kinds of issues in the future. But the bottom line is that whatever material this goes on, epoxy primer is just really good stuff. So with these panels scuffed up and wiped down with some of Eastwood's pre-painting prep solvent, these were ready to see some action. And I should mention that this gun I'm using comes with a 1.3mm tip from the factory, but that can be changed to a different size like this 2mm tip. The bigger tip here is really helpful for the epoxy primer, because it's a lot thicker than normal paint, especially so because I didn't reduce it at all. Basically, I didn't dilute it down. But with that tip on, it's ready to start spraying. I didn't have the settings dialed in super well. The fluid definitely should have been pulled back because it was going on a little too heavy, but for the most part, it laid down very well. Now I wanted to lay down 2 solid coats, so about 30 minutes after I finished the first one, the next coat went on. Alright, these look pretty good, but the epoxy does have to cure for a while, and it's pretty late right now, so for now, I'm gonna call it a night. Weather can be a real bitch. The storm that happened overnight did a bit of damage. It knocked over all this stuff, and even my neighbor's tree. And not stopping there, the rain blew through the crack of the doors of the barn, splattering onto the floor and onto the parts. There's spots everywhere. I'm glad this happened during the primer stage because fortunately, all of these spots will just be gone when I sand the panels. But if this were color or clear coat, it might have actually been a problem. Before I start sanding these down though, the epoxy primer needs to cure for at least 2 days. So now would be a good time to spray the hood and the deck lid. Unfortunately, my battery died right before I started laying down the first coat. But hey, it went on great. And after about a 30-minute flash period, the second coat went on too. I made sure to have a fresh battery in this time, which I'm sure you can tell. This also went on very, very smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that I don't think I'm going to have to do much sanding for this because it's so even and undisturbed. June bugs. In May, no less. That is just fantastic. Well, at least we can take away a few things from this experience. Ventilation is important, no doubt, but maybe don't paint in an area that isn't fully enclosed, or if you do, how about throw up some plastic sheets or something for the bugs, yes, but also because overspray is a very real thing. My toolkit went from a dark black to a nice shade of primer gray. Now a little bit of elbow grease does get rid of it, but maybe taking steps to avoid it might be nice. Yeah. Luckily for me, everything in the barn is already covered in so much dust that the overspray just wipes away, but if you are working in a cleaner space than me, then I recommend trying to keep it that way. So for the June bugs, there's not really much I can do about this right now. I'm just going to have to leave this to cure for the time being. One more day of waiting and now I could start taking care of the fenders and lower quarter panels. They might look nice at a glance, but as with all the panels on this car, there's some issues. Little chips here and there, as well as the remnants of the repair job done on the fenders. First things first, more sanding. Starting with the lower quarters, I went over the whole thing with 320 grit. And after getting as much as I could, I wet sanded, or wet scuffed the whole thing with a maroon scuff pad. And after wiping it clean, you can see that all the gloss has been removed from the part. This means that the body filler needed to fill the little imperfections will have a good bite into the surface. And for that filling, I'm using Bondo brand body filler, specifically their gold formula. The gold formula is a little bit less viscous than the normal type of filler, so it applies pretty nicely. You really want to spread this stuff on thinly, only apply as much as you need. And after about 30 minutes of cure time, I went back and sanded it smooth. Nice. And just like applying it, you really want it as thin as you can get with the panel still having the right contour. And because this just has little divots to fill in, it is really easy. And it looks really good. More sanding was done for the driver's side quarter as well, but not filling, because luckily this side didn't have any chips or anything to fill in. So just the sanding got it good enough for the next stage. For the fenders, there weren't any chips or anything to take care of, but like I said, there were the imperfections from the repairs. After sanding everything down, a little bit of filler was applied. Then it was sanded smooth. So the divots were filled in, but there was still something not quite right with the passenger side fender. I actually knew about this issue for about a year now, and that is that the panel has a decent amount of material removed from it. The edge line is pretty wavy and not straight up like it should be. That's nothing a little filler can't fix though. For the bulk of the buildup, I used some of the fiberglass infused body filler. That way it has a bit more structure to it. And after sanding that back, more of the gold filler was applied as well for a final pass. Nice! It's a subtle difference, but it's worth spending the time to do. Okay, so for these parts, all issues have been addressed. Every surface is smooth and looking good. They're just about ready for paint, except that painting directly over plastic body filler and the raw urethane is a big no-no. So, more primer. Instead of mixing up more of the epoxy primer for the gun, I wanted to test out this aerosol version. And it still is a two-component system, you just have to crack open a container inside the can to mix the two parts together. And that too went on pretty well. Though I gotta say that this actually wasn't quite what I was expecting, because this is Eastwood's gray epoxy primer, and this is also Eastwood's gray epoxy primer. But it's white. It's definitely white, not gray at all. I mean, it'll still do its job of being a barrier for the filler and plastic surface, but this means that before I lay down any color, it's going to be best to apply a coat of sealer. It's possible that with the color variation right now that it would show through the red paint, causing it to look all splotchy. Now with enough layers of color you wouldn't have that issue, but doing a single coat of sealer first is easy enough. But wowee, look at the results of this work.
Not bad. Not bad at all. What is still bad is the hood. And just like everything else, the first step is sanding it all down. So after knocking the primer back, I washed away all of whatever dust was left over from the sanding process. I started to use a Sharpie to mark out what areas needed filler, but it quickly grew to pretty much the whole surface.
Yeah, there's so much fucking shit everywhere.
So I just started applying. And again, this is more of the gold filler. 30 minutes later, after it cured, the sander was once again implemented in order to bring it back down to be smooth. It did a great job, but while it is smooth, it's now wavy. It's not really visible at all now, but it's very easy to feel. On a panel as big and especially flat as this is, you absolutely want to use a sanding block. These are without a doubt needed in order to get the right contour. I don't have the best technique, but the basic idea is that you move in 45-degree strokes back and forth. So after doing a lot of that over the whole panel, it is now
smooth. Very smooth.
So now I want to do the same as the other panels and seal up all of this body filler. And to do that, I just used some aerosol filler primer that I already had. Besides the splotchiness, this looks pretty good. At first. Look a little closer and you start seeing a lot of the little imperfections. Now these are small enough that they don't warrant full-on body filler, so instead they can be remedied with what's called glazing putty. There's several different types, some you still have to mix together, and others, like this type, that just dry through solvent evaporation. You can apply it with a little spreader, but it's honestly just easier to finger paint it on. Actually, hey, whatever painting I do is finger painting, right? After about half an hour, I went back and wet sanded all of this smooth. Now you don't have to wet sand this, but I've found that it really helps avoid getting the sandpaper all clumpy with the putty. So a little more primer goes on, and voila! The hood is now also ready for a final wet sanding before sealer and paint. Luckily for the deck lid, there wasn't that much damage from the June bugs. There are a few scratches here and there, but nothing too bad cosmetically. What is too bad mechanically is the hole for the piece of hardware that secures the luggage rack down. Apparently I'm an old man for this, but I actually want to keep the luggage rack. And to do that, I need to fix this hole. What goes in here is called a well nut. I had a good joke for this, but I can't recall what it was. Well, nuts. Anyways, they're essentially a capped off rubber cylinder with an embedded nut at the opposite end of the cap. The one that was in this particular hole was stuck in there pretty badly. I may or may not have accidentally damaged the surrounding material a whole lot. I ended up widening the entire hole when I was trying to get it out. That's an issue because these well nuts work by expansion. When they're in the hole they're supposed to be in, and you place whatever object is being secured on top, threading in the bolt pulls the nut at the end of the rubber cylinder up, expanding the entire thing, sandwiching itself. Pretty neat stuff, but it doesn't work if the hole is too big because it would just pop right out. So I need to make this hole a little bit smaller. Initially, you might think to build up body filler around the edge, and that certainly would reduce the diameter, but any amount of force pulling up on the rack would just cause that tiny ring of filler to just crack right off. That method would pretty much be a complete waste of time. There needs to be solid structure right up to the edge of the hole. So for this repair, it's actually going to be pretty similar to the one I did for the deck lid's lock cylinder hole back in part 8, except that this hole has a job to do. The little strips of fiberglass I added just around the edge aren't going to cut it for this repair. After sanding back the surface down to the SMC body, I added a few layers of fiberglass cloth. But I made sure to have the discs be fairly large, because what will be doing all the securing is the bonding of these two materials, the fiberglass to the SMC, which is why I'm building the fiberglass out, trying to maximize the surface area of adhesion. About a few hours later, the resin is now cured. The whole thing was then sanded flat. Then I applied some body filler, then sanded that back, then sprayed on a little bit of filler primer. Now, to add in the correct sized hole in the correct spot, I placed the luggage rack onto the body and marked out the hole exactly. Nice! I'm fairly confident that this is going to work just fine. Now that was a decent amount of work for just one teeny tiny hole, and there's still the entire rest of the deck lid to take care of. Luckily at this point though, the bodywork is essentially the exact same process as before. Sand everything, apply filler where needed, sand again, and again, clean, prime, glazing putty, sand, and prime again. And now that is the deck lid fully prepped and just about ready for paint. In fact, that's actually pretty much the exact process for every single one of these panels. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it all. Well, I guess I better get to work. Okay, did I mention that I hate bodywork? I really do. Wrenching is fun because the process of repairing, replacing, or even just disassembling is always at least a little different depending on what component you're working on. But this, whether it's the roof or a fender, it's primer, it's sanding, it's filler, it's sanding, it's definitely sanding. It's all the exact same. I'm positive that some people enjoy this process. I am not one of those people. But hey, it's done now. With the exception of the rear bumper. Okay, also with the exception of the driver's side door skin, but the process for that is literally the exact same as the passenger side, and I'm not gonna make you sit through the same footage twice. Okay, now all that's left is the rear bumper. The reason I saved the rear bumper for last is that
it's not exactly going to be just the same as every other panel was. Besides the repairs that were done in part 8 of the series, the bodywork for everything else has really just been fixing small imperfections in the panels, little scratches or nibs here and there, and some tiny pinholes after body filler was applied. Nothing really too major. The bottom line is that all that bodywork was just fixing imperfections in the contour of the panel, but with this rear bumper, the body filler is not going to fix the imperfections in the contour. It's actually going to be the contour because of how damaged this panel is. And with that, there are some concerns.
There's the same scratches and little divots like on everything else, but there's more damage than just that. Not from an accident or anything like that, but just because of the nature of the material. It may be a little difficult to see now because everything is a uniform gray, but all these chunks missing here, all of what were these yellow spots that can be seen even back in part 1 when I did the initial cleaning, are just the results of the sun, nature, and the use of urethane for the panel. The plastic breaks down and comes apart. One of the bigger reasons why I replaced the front bumper was just because of this same damage. It was just so bad. Now, if the trim pieces were separate, just like how the rest of them are, you can bet that I would just swap them out. But because they are all one piece, just painted a different color, I have to fix this. The replacement bumper that I got for the front did have its fair share of similar issues, but only with teeny tiny bits missing, and luckily just glazing putty was enough to fix those small problems. The reason I kept the rear was because the damage, although a lot, was nowhere near as bad as the front. So, to repair this, I plan to do the bulk of the filling with more of the fiberglass reinforced body filler. Easy to apply, easy enough to sand, and it will be a bit more structural than just plain body filler. The concern I spoke about is the fact that this is urethane. It's floppy, it's flexible. Now with the epoxy primer on, the body filler will definitely have a solid bond, but will it withstand the level of flex that the panel can go through? Now I know that when everything's bolted up, it'll be solid and not really want to flex at all, but in the event of a rear end collision, what might have only been a little bump with no real damage, there otherwise could be cracks and splits in the places with filler. I think that the right thing to do would be to order flexible body filler designed to be used in situations exactly like this, but I don't want to spend more money and I don't want to have to wait for more things to be mailed to me. So, I'm gonna work with what I got. Just like everything else, the first step is sanding. 320 grit on the pneumatic sander was used over the majority of the surface. And whatever places I couldn't get with the power tool, I went back and hand sanded. After blowing all the dust off and giving the panel a good cleaning, and then wiped down with Eastwood's wax and grease remover, their pre-painting prep, the fiberglass filler was ready to be applied. This hairy, greenish-brown mess was slathered onto all areas with large craters, filling out the contour of the panel, as well as whatever little divots I could find. For the trim section that wraps around the whole car, it was a balancing act of applying, spreading, and then cleaning up any extra that spilled over into the groove. But once that cured, which was about half an hour later, I sanded the bulk of that back with the disc sander. I did have to go back and hand sand all of the grooves, but after that, throw on a little primer, give it a little bit of wet sanding, and you're left with a panel as smooth as onion skin. Well, at least just in this tiny section of the bumper. I still have the rest to do. After repeating everything from before, all of the big issues are taken care of. And we're where we would have started with any of the other panels. Just little imperfections to deal with now. The bumper is coated in so much dust, it's honestly just easiest to thoroughly wash it with a strong detergent. It's definitely not a good idea to use normal car soap for this because a lot of the time they have wax or some kind of protectant built into it. That's good after you're done painting, but not before. But one thing to really be careful of is if you do this wash with body filler, is the amount of moisture that the body filler can soak up. If you don't have the patience to leave it to dry for a good while, you better be sure to go over the entire thing with a few passes of either a blow dryer or a heat gun. You really want to ensure that all of the moisture is out. And once it is, it's time for finger painting on the glazing putty. The sanding block kit that I got has this really nice round piece that's great for concave surfaces like this. Spraying on that coat of filler primer revealed a few more areas of issue, so those were gone over yet again with more glazing putty. Then, more primer.
I still need to go over the entire thing with 320 grit and then 400 grit sandpaper before I do any of the sealer, color, and clear coat. And hell, I still even might do another coat of the epoxy primer just to really seal in the surface because of the sheer amount of body filler that I added. But for the most part, the bodywork is done. The bodywork for every single panel on this car is done.
There isn't a single imperfection that I was bothered to fix left on these panels. It was a hell of a lot of work to get to this point. A lot of repetitive work. I'd be lying if I said that burnout wasn't part of the reason this video took so long to come out. I was genuinely getting really tired of all this. But it's done now, and I can finally lay down some paint and make this car look just as good, if not better, than how it did when it rolled off the assembly line. And that is going to come in the next episode. I think that this was more than enough work for this video of my Fiero series. Before I sign off, I want to address what may be an elephant in the room for some people. This is part 10 of the Fiero series. I point that out because when I originally announced the series, and through narration, comments, and even with the list I wrote down on my whiteboard 2.5 years ago, I have always planned on making this series 10 videos long. 10 easily digestible videos for the entire Fiero project. That's the way I wanted to do it. Now clearly, that didn't happen. Especially so if you include the Fiero focused Saturday project videos, which if we're being honest with each other are just more Fiero episodes only under a different title. We're already 15 videos into this series. Now I wholeheartedly believe that nobody should ever have to explain themselves for their creative decisions. Make what you want to make, tell the story you want to tell, no matter how long or short you want to make it. However, I think that this is actually a pretty good parallel, not just with the actual Fiero restoration specifically, but for any project car. Plans change, and things are gonna take a lot longer than you might have anticipated. Whether that's because you had poor judgment on how long a job would take, or you had the while I'm in here mentality and ended up doing a lot more than you originally planned to. Whatever it is, you learn that things take time. A lot of time. Especially so if you end up fully restoring a car when the original plan was just to get it somewhat presentable. So if you haven't already done so, get ready to course correct because you're gonna have to at some point.
So for those of you that expected or even wanted to see the Fiero done in this episode, I'm sorry, but I hope you understand. There is still a lot more work to do, even after painting. But I would much rather not leave you all with blue balls, so how about instead I give you all a subpar orgasm. So before this video ends, I am going to put the bodywork on the car. 1, for some instant gratification, but 2, also to get an idea of how far we've come with the bodywork. But before that, I want to do something else. I realize that I don't think at any point in the series I've shown a proper cold start for the Fiero. So, here you go. Yeah, in all honesty, I don't think that this engine sounds particularly nice. It's kinda just an engine. But hey, it's always going to sound great to me, knowing that at one point it was out of the car and just a pile of parts thrown around my barn. The fact that it's running strong now is music to my ears. But what's great about these panels is that pretty much all of them can go on and be held up just by resting on their mounting surface. It's definitely not enough to hold together for even a trip down to the end of my driveway, but for getting a good thumbnail for this video, oh yeah. In all honesty though, wow. I know it's not done, but this looks fantastic. Granted, I don't have all the panels on, I didn't even bother with the passenger side, but overall, wow. The car that it was is merely a distant memory at this point. Never again will it resemble a pile of trash, how it did when I pulled it out of the dirt. I think that unfinished is definitely a better aesthetic than neglected, but even unfinished will also be a distant memory soon enough. I said that the painting process is about 95% prep work, so the last 5% that is the actual painting hopefully shouldn't take that long. However long it is, I promise you'll see paint on every single one of these panels in the next video. I swear. So, until next time, I will see you guys later.